Okay, we've got a special report tonight. About 2 years ago, in February 2011, we interviewed this doctor on the show. Her name is Dr. Mila Means. She grew up in Wichita, Kansas. She went to college at Wichita State. She went to medical school at the University of Kansas. She then became a family doctor in her hometown. The friendly lady with the bright red hair who gives vaccines to little kids and arthritis medication to the older folks, in her family practice in an office park in Wichita. Dr. Means was not a particularly remarkable doctor in the way we usually think of remarkable doctors. She was not a standout in her field in any way. The reason we had her on this show, the reason we were talking to her in 2011 is because she was planning on doing something quite amazing and quite newsworthy and quite brave. What she planned to do was to essentially take over the practice of this man, Dr. George Tiller. Dr. Tiller was also from Kansas. He was born in Wichita. He was the son of a family doctor. He went to medical school in Kansas. He joined the Navy. He became a flight surgeon. George Tiller really wanted to become a dermatologist. But just as he was starting his residency, his parents were killed. And he ended up, unexpectedly, having to take over his father's family practice back home in his hometown. Turns out his father had been quietly offering abortions in Wichita starting in the 1940s. And when he took over his father's practice, the younger Dr. Tiller realized that women still needed that service in Wichita. By then it was the mid-1970s. Because he made that choice to continue his father's practice, Dr. George Tiller became the target of the violent, radical fringe of the anti-abortion movement. His clinic was bombed in 1986. The next day, he moved his practice to a secret location, and he kept going. 5 years later, in the summer of 1991, protesters began blockading his clinic. They chained themselves to the fence outside his clinic, blocking access for patients and for staff. Then in 1993, a woman who had been part of those protests tried to kill Dr. Tiller. She walked up to him in his car in the clinic parking lot, and she shot him. She opened fire. She ended up hitting him in both of his arms. Dr. Tiller not only survived, he returned to work the next day. Around that same time, it is believed that some extreme anti-abortion activists had started circulating this wanted poster for Dr. Tiller, making clear that he was a marked man. And then in 2009, an anti-abortion activist walked into Dr. Tiller's Wichita church. His church, the only place where Dr. Tiller showed up at the same time every week, a place they knew he could be found at that time. And Scott Roeder shot George Tiller dead. And when they killed George Tiller in that church in 2009, that ended abortion in Wichita. Actually, in that whole part of Kansas. Dr. Tiller's clinic was closed down after his murder. It has been vacant in Wichita ever since. When we interviewed Dr. Mila Means in 2011, she was planning on picking up where Dr. Tiller left off. She had begun the extra training she needed to become an abortion provider so she could offer that service in addition to her family practice. She was going to reestablish access to abortion in Wichita despite the horrific litany of what had ended it there before. That was her plan, but it did not happen. Dr. Means was open about what she wanted to do. She soon found herself sued by her landlord for, quote, creating a clear nuisance after protesters showed up at her family practice. Protesters also showed up at her house. They sent around a poster describing her as an unspeakable, horrific murderer who earns blood money. They gave out her office address and told their followers, don't ignore her, do provoke her. Dr. Means received this letter telling her, quote, you will be checking under your car every day because maybe today is the day someone places an explosive under it. Ultimately, Dr. Means just hit too many obstacles, too much opposition. She had to set aside her plan. Next Tuesday is the 40th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision that established that American women have a constitutional right to access abortion services if they want them. A state cannot make abortion illegal. And on the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, the national story of its impact 40 years on is not mostly a story about litigation. It's not really a story about the Supreme Court anymore. It turns out that the story is mostly now about how something in our country can be both legal and essentially unprotected. So that while on paper you have a certain right, the people who would afford you access to that right are hounded and harassed and threatened and attacked and killed to the point where your right exists really only on paper, and it ceases to exist in the actual world, in your actual life, when you need it and when the Constitution is supposed to guarantee it for you. But the other story, which we are able to bring you tonight, is how actually some Americans are finding a way. It does not work every time, and the resistance is almost unimaginable, and in some cases it is unimaginably violent. After all, it was murdering the doctor that in 2009 ended access to abortion in the heart of Kansas. But now, and this is our story tonight, that access is coming back. That exact office is in fact reopening. It's not Dr. Means. It's happening by other means, against the odds, against the opposition that made it impossible for others, but not impossible for everyone. That access is being reopened in Kansas by a group of people who are not naive, who know exactly what they are up against. But it turns out that is part of why they are doing it, and they are getting it done. And that is our story. Next.